Mysteries await just a page away. Ready to dive in? Welcome to The Book Reader, where stories unfold one enchanting page at a time. Subscribe now and unlock the magic.
Richard Branson. Losing My Virginity, the autobiography. Chapter 1. 7. It's called Tubular Bells. I've never heard anything like it. 1972, 1973. Since Mike Oldfield was the first artist we signed, we had no idea what sort of a contract to offer him. Luckily, Sandy Denny, who originally sang with Fairport Convention but had now gone solo, had recently recorded at the Manor. She had become a friend of mine, and I asked her for a copy of her contract with Island Records. This was apparently a standard Island Records deal, and we retyped it word for word, changing Island Records to Virgin Music and Sandy Denny to Mike Oldfield. It set out that Mike would make 10 albums for Virgin Music and receive a 5% royalty on 90% of the wholesale value of the record. Since Mike had no money, we put him on the standard Virgin salary, which we all received, £20 a week. We would then deduct it from any future royalties, if they ever materialized. Although Simon and I loved Mike's music, we never thought that we'd make any money from it. It took Mike well into 1973 to record what became known as Tubular Bells. It was a fantastically complicated sequence of recordings to make, and he and Tom Newman went over it again and again in the recording studio, mixing, dubbing, and fine-tuning all the different layers of music. Mike played over 20 different instruments and made over 2,300 different recordings until he was happy. In the meantime, we were still trying to rent out the Manor to any band we could find, so Mike was often interrupted and had to clear his kit out of the recording studio to make way for the Rolling Stones or Adam Faith. Frank Zappa had made his reputation as one of the most original, innovative, and irreverent performers in rock music. His albums, like We're Only in It for the Money and Weasels Ripped My Flesh, were filled with biting satire. And when he came up to the Manor to investigate the possibilities of recording there, I felt sure he would appreciate a joke. I drove Frank up from London myself, enthusing about the wonderful manor house in which the studio was situated. But instead of taking the road to Shipton-on-Cherwell, I made a detour to nearby Woodstock. I turned off the road, under a majestic arch, and drove down a long gravel driveway to the door of a magnificent house. "I'll park the car," I told Frank. "Just knock on the door and tell them who you are." The door was opened by a uniformed footman. Funnily enough, he didn't recognize Frank Zappa, and was not amused to be told the long-haired musician had come to stay. Did Zappa know, the footman asked, that he was knocking at the door of Blenheim Palace, the ancestral seat of the Dukes of Marlborough? Frank got back into the car, swearing that he could see the funny side of it, but he never did record at the Manor. On July 22, 1972, Kristen and I were married at the tiny church at Shipton-on-Cherwell. I had just turned 22, and Kristen was still 20. We had known each other only since May of the previous year. I still have a copy of the invitation we sent out for the party before the wedding. It reads, "Kristen and I have decided to get married, and we thought that this would be a good excuse for a party. There will be a pig on a spit, so please come since the pig will not last. The scaffold will be playing." One of the best things about the Manor was that it lent itself to having wonderful parties. We had bands who were happy to play, a river to swim in, huge rooms with ancient fireplaces, and a cloistered courtyard which caught the sun. Our wedding barbecue was a great feast, with all the villagers from Shipton-on-Cherwell mixing with the Virgin staff, and a great many of the rock bands around at the time. The wedding day was extraordinary throughout. As we were waiting at the church for Kristen to arrive, A huge articulated lorry started to squeeze its way down the narrow lane towards us. Nobody could understand what it was doing, until a tiny old lady in a blue suit with a blue hat jammed onto her head climbed out. "I'm not too late, am I?" Granny called out. The lorry had crashed into her car coming through Oxford, and she had insisted that the driver take her to our wedding. My parents gave us a beautiful old Bentley with red leather seats and a walnut dashboard as a wedding present. Although it tended to break down as much as my Morris Minor, it was supremely comfortable to sit in while we were towed along. One of Kristen's bridesmaids was her sister Meryl, and Nick was my best man. At the reception afterward, it became clear that there was a certain chemistry between them, and late that night they headed off towards a room in the manor. By the time Kristen and I returned from honeymoon, Nick and Meryl had announced that they too were getting married. Nick and Meryl were married even faster than Kristen and I. Their wedding was in the winter of 1972, just 5 months after they had met. Kristen and I found this marriage a little claustrophobic. I would spend all day with Nick at South Wharf Road, and then I would also see him and Meryl together in the evenings. Unfortunately, one of the reasons why Kristen had come to England was to escape from her family, and now she found that she and her sister had married 2 men who practically lived in each other's pocket. Incestuous wasn't the word for it. On top of that, Nick and I, who had run Virgin very much as a singles company, suddenly found ourselves both married. It was something of a culture shock. Throughout the winter of 1972 and the spring of 1973, Mike Oldfield was living at the manor and recording Tubular Bells. I think this was the happiest time of his life. He was there with Tom Newman, who was obsessed by the technology of recording, and they could endlessly refine the recordings together. Mundy was still living there. When Kristen and I drove up to the manor on a Friday night, we would find Mike, Tom, and Mundy sitting on cushions on the floor, stoking up the vast fire and listening to the latest tapes. They were oblivious to the outside world. Tubular Bells was finally ready for release in May 1973. We knew that we had something extraordinary on our hands when we started selling Tubular Bells into the trade. Simon took the recording along to the sales conference at Island Records, who were going to distribute the album. They were all in a large conference room at a hotel near Birmingham. They had already had to listen to hours of music. These men had heard it all before, literally. Simon put on Tubular Bells, and they listened to the first side in its entirety. When it finished, there was an outburst of applause. This was Simon's first sales conference, and so he had no idea that it was unprecedented. He never again heard a roomful of world-weary salesmen applauding a new record. On May 25, 1973, Virgin Music released its first 4 albums: Mike Oldfield's Tubular Bells, Flying Teapot by Gong, Manor Live, a jam session from the Manor led by Elkie Brooks, and the Faust tapes by Faust, a German band. 1973 was an extraordinary year for rock and pop music. That summer saw the singles chart dominated by the glam rock of Suzi Quatro, Wizard, Gary Glitter, and The Sweet. But there was also a large Motown contingent, with Stevie Wonder, Gladys Knight and the Pips, the Jackson 5 and Barry White. At the other end of the spectrum from these singers were Lou Reed, with Take a Walk on the Wild Side, and 10 Cubic Centimeters, with Rubber Bullets. The album charts were headed by David Bowie at number 1 with Aladdin Sane, the first proof of how he could reinvent himself to stay at the top. Below him were the Beatles with their 1962, 1966 and 1967, 1970 double albums, Pink Floyd with Dark Side of the Moon, Lou Reed's Transformer, and Roxy Music's For Your Pleasure. In the face of this competition, we had to fight hard to attract attention for Virgin's first 4 releases. But it was Tubular Bells that really captured people's imagination. It was completely original and immediately spellbinding. People found it addictive and played it again and again, both to listen to the music and to marvel at how Mike had woven it all together. I remember a review in NME that I had to reread several times before I realized that, although I would never understand what the critic was actually saying, he was clearly raving about it. NME was the single most influential music paper. With it praising Tubular Bells, everyone would look out for it. Aside from the reviews, I knew that, as soon as we could get people to listen to Tubular Bells once, it would take off. As one critic correctly said, one hearing should provide sufficient proof. The problem was getting that hearing. I called up every radio producer I could, trying to persuade them to play Tubular Bells. But at that time 3-minute singles dominated radio music. There was no room for a 45-minute piece of music without words. Radio 3 turned it down because it wasn't Mozart, and Radio 1 turned it down because it wasn't Gary Glitter. For the first 2 weeks, sales of Tubular Bells were stillborn. Then I invited John Peel over to Alberta for lunch. We had known each other since I had interviewed him for Student. He had also started his own record label Dandelion. He was the only person who played serious rock music on the radio, and his show was our only chance of winning airtime for Tubular Bells. We all had lunch on Alberta, and then settled down on the sofas. I put on Tubular Bells. He was amazed. "I've never heard anything like it," John finally said. Later that week we listened to John Peel's laconic voice coming out of the radio. I was sitting on the deck of the houseboat with Mike Oldfield and everyone from Virgin. "Tonight I'm not going to play a whole lot of records. I'm just going to play you one by a young composer called Mike Oldfield. It's his first record, and it's called Tubular Bells. I've never heard anything like it in my life. It's released by Virgin, a brand new record label, and it was recorded at Virgin's own studios in Oxfordshire. You'll never forget this." With that, Tubular Bells started. I was lying on the sofa. Everyone was lounging around in deep armchairs or on the rug, and we passed round beer and wine, cigarettes and joints. I tried to relax. I could see everyone else lying there totally spellbound by the music, but I kept worrying. I find it impossible to stop my brain from churning through all the ideas and possibilities facing me at any given moment. I wondered how many people were listening to the John Peel show. How many of those would go out and buy Tubular Bells the next day? Whether they would wait until Saturday, or would have forgotten about it by then. Would they come to the Virgin shops or order it from Smith's? How fast would we receive the royalties? How many copies would we have to reprint? How should we break it in America? On one level I was absorbed in the music, but I felt like an outsider. I couldn't lose myself in it like Simon or Nick, or my lovely new assistant Penny, who was a real beauty with long black wavy hair and a generous smile. I was too aware that Virgin needed to sell a lot of copies to make money for next month's tax repayment. I knew that Flying Teapot and the Faust tapes were hardly going to knock the Rolling Stones or Bob Dylan off the charts. But Tubular Bells was extraordinary. Something must happen from tonight's broadcast. Virgin would never be able to afford to buy such a length of radio time to advertise it. Mike Oldfield sat in silence. He leant against Penny and stared straight at the radio. I wondered what was going through his head. I had wedged a sleeve of Tubular Bells, which showed a giant tubular bell suspended over the sea with a wave breaking in the foreground, above one of the picture frames. Mike stared at it, as if he was staring out to sea. A greedy thought swam in the murky depths of my mind. Perhaps he was already dreaming up another album? All the next day the phones rang with orders from record shops for Tubular Bells, as well as choosing to break all tradition by playing it in its entirety. John Peel reviewed Tubular Bells for the listener. On the all too frequent occasions when I'm told that a record by a contemporary rock musician is a work of lasting importance, I tend to reach for my hat and head for the wide open spaces. Today these experts would probably tell you that in 20 years' time collectors will still be enthusing over the records of such weighty bands as Yes and Emerson, Lake and Palmer. I'm ready to bet you a few shillings that Yes and Yelpy will have vanished from the memory of all but the most stubborn, and that the Gary Glitters and Sweets of no lasting value will be regarded as representing the true sound of the 1970s. Having said that, I'm going to tell you about a new recording of such strength, energy, and real beauty that to me it represents the first breakthrough into history that any musician regarded primarily as a rock musician has made. Mike Oldfield. John Peel had an enormous following, and what he said was picked up by thousands of people across the country. We arranged for both Gong and Faust to tour the country, but it was the Grand Tubular Bells concert planned for June 25th, which I hoped would bring the national press to witness the music celebrity of the moment. We made the Tubular Bells concert into an unmissable event. We managed to have Mick Taylor, then the Rolling Stones guitarist, Steve Hilliage and Hatfield, and the North all agree to play various instruments. Viv Stanshall from the Bonzo Dog Doodah Band agreed to be on stage and announced the instruments as he did on the record. On the day of the concert, Mike came round to see me on the houseboat. "Richard," he said quietly, "I can't go through with this concert tonight." "But it's all arranged," I said. "I simply can't go ahead," he repeated in a deathly whisper. I felt a wave of despair. I knew Mike could be as stubborn as me when he wanted to be. I tried to forget that the whole concert was arranged, the tickets sold, and even television coverage agreed. I couldn't use any of that as leverage, since it would only strengthen Mike's resolve. I had to be cunning. "Let's go for a drive," I said innocuously, and led the way along the towpath and to my old Bentley parked outside. I knew that Mike had always admired this battleship gray car, with its faded red leather seats. I hoped that a soothing drive past the Queen Elizabeth Hall would put Mike in a different frame of mind. We drove off with Mike sitting bolt upright. After a monosyllabic drive we reached the Queen Elizabeth Hall, and I slowed down. There were Mike Oldfield posters everywhere. Already a crowd of people were making their way to the concert. "I can't go on to the stage," Mike repeated. I couldn't tell him that it was in his best interests, that this concert might catapult him into a different league and put him up alongside Pink Floyd. I stopped the car. "Do you want to drive?" "All right," Mike said cautiously. We drove on, over Westminster Bridge past Victoria. I watched Hyde Park flash past the passenger window. Mike turned down Bayswater Road and drove near to the church where I had edited Student Magazine. "Mike," I said, "would you like to have this car? As a present?" "A present?" "Yes. I'll get out here and walk home. You just keep on driving and the car's yours. Come off it. It was your wedding present. All you have to do is then drive it round to the Queen Elizabeth Hall and go up on stage tonight. It's yours." A silence fell between us. I watched Mike as he held the steering wheel and imagined himself driving this car. I knew he was tempted. I hoped he would agree. "It's a deal," Mike said. I would have to tell Kristen and then my parents what I had done with our Bentley, but I knew they wouldn't mind too much. For all its charm and sentimental value, the Bentley was just a car. It was vital to get Mike up on stage and sell copies of Tubular Bells. If he was successful, I would be able to pick up any car I wanted. My mother would have approved. As the last bars of Tubular Bells died away at the Queen Elizabeth Hall, there was a momentary silence as people digested what they had just heard. They seemed mesmerized and nobody wanted to break the spell. Then they leapt to their feet in a standing ovation. I was sitting between Kristen and Simon, and we stood up and cheered and applauded. Tears ran down my cheeks. Mike stood up in front of the organ, a tiny figure, and just bowed and said thank you. Even the band applauded him. He was a new star. That night we sold hundreds of copies of Tubular Bells. Mike was too shattered to speak to the press. Looking at all the people cheering and crowding round to buy his record, he said, "I feel as if I've been raped," and disappeared off in his new Bentley. Mike refused to go back on stage for many years afterward. Kristen and I walked home. From that night onward, Mike Oldfield's Tubular Bells was set to become the most celebrated album of the year. Virgin music was on the map, and the money started rolling in. Word of mouth spread, and on July 14, Tubular Bells entered the album charts at number 23. By August it was number 1. For the next 15 years, whenever Mike Oldfield released an album it reached the top 10. Tubular Bells eventually sold over 13 million copies, making it the 11th best-selling album ever released in Britain. The sacrifice of my Bentley was worth it. I never got round to buying another one. Although Overnight Virgin was an established record label, we were a tiny company with a staff of 7 and no ability to distribute records to all the record shops across the country. We had 2 options open to us. The first was to license our records to another larger record label. This would work only for fairly successful bands. The other company would give us an upfront payment for the right to promote the record, distribute it, and keep the bulk of the profits. If the record recouped its advance, the record company would pay us a royalty, typically around 16%. This was the traditional arrangement for a fledgling record company like Virgin. The second option was more risky. Virgin would forego the upfront payment and the royalties, and simply pay another record label to manufacture and distribute the records, as and when they were ordered by shops around the country. Virgin would be responsible for all the promotion of its records, and carry all the risk if the record failed. Correspondingly, we would have all the upside if the record sold well. Most small record labels licensed their records since it was easy money. They received 16% royalties from the other company and paid out whatever they had agreed to the artist, say 5 or 10%. But Simon and I decided that we would go for a manufacture and distribution deal. It was a bold move, but even then I knew that it is only by being bold that you get anywhere. If you are a risk taker, then the art is to protect the downside. It seemed to us that Tubular Bells was so good that we could promote it ourselves. I felt sure that it would sell enough copies to pay back our investment. With the idea of asking for a Pan-D deal, rather than a straight licensing agreement, we went to see Island Records. I had first come across Island Records when I was editing Student Magazine. It had been set up by Chris Blackwell, who was brought up in Jamaica, and had almost single-handedly introduced reggae into Britain. Island released Bob Marley, who became the first reggae superstar, and among others they also produced Cat Stevens and Free. Predictably, at first Island refused to do a Pan-D deal. They already licensed Chrysalis and Charisma, and they wanted Virgin too. So they offered us a highly attractive licensing deal with royalties of 18%. We were paying Mike 5%, which meant that if we accepted Island's offer we could collect 13% of the sales of Tubular Bells for ourselves. At £2.19 this was 28.5 a record, which would mean a total profit to us of around £171,000 if Tubular Bells did astoundingly well and sold, say 600,000 copies. That is to say reached double platinum. A record goes gold at 200,000 copies and platinum at 300,000 copies. If it reached 1 million copies, Then Virgin would make £285,000 without having to pay for any of the costs of promoting and marketing the record. To a seasoned Island were far better placed than Virgin to promote this record to all the shops across the country. Most small record companies in our place would have accepted it, and certainly both Island and our lawyers urged us to do so. But Simon and I felt differently. We had 14 Virgin shops across the country, which could promote Tubular Bells. The experience of selling 100,000 copies of Student across the country had given me confidence that we could get this record out in quantity. Of course, our job was made much easier because Tubular Bells was so good that people wanted to buy it as soon as they heard it. To an outsider, this looked like an enormous gamble. If sales of Tubular Bells had faded, Virgin Music would have been dead in the water. But if we managed to sell 600,000 copies, worth about £1.3 million, Virgin would receive around £920,000 after the shop's retail margin. Of this, we would pay £65,700 to Mike Oldfield as the artist and £197,100 to Island Records for pressing and distributing the record, leaving us with around £658,000 to divide between promoting the record and keeping as profit to reinvest in other artists. This was the upside. The intellectual copyright of Tubular Bells was our birthright, and we were determined to build on it. So we turned down Island's offer and insisted that we stick to a Pan-D deal. They would press and distribute the record, and we would pay them between 10 and 15% for this. They still held out for a licensing deal until we threatened to go to a rival record company, CBS. So we signed a Pan-D deal and sacrificed an immediate cash payment, which would have been welcomed by Coutts. Since the manor was still in debt, we committed ourselves to selling Tubular Bells with our own resources. Island unwittingly fostered a cuckoo which grew up in their nest, Virgin Music. We became rich beyond our dreams as the sales of Tubular Bells shot through silver, gold, platinum, double platinum, and then up over 1 million copies. We grew into a major force in the record industry, and eventually became the rival to Island Records. Although the royalty rates we paid Mike Oldfield and Island changed over time, as did the price of the record, Tubular Bells went on to sell millions of copies, and still sells around the world today. Our gamble that we could promote it ourselves made us our first fortune.
And that marks the end of the current chapter. Thank you for listening to The Book Reader. Stay tuned for the next episode tomorrow. Please subscribe for updates.